Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, I guess we're on the record now, so we will start officially in a meeting. How's my sound, by the way? Can you hear me well?
Sound good.
Okay, excellent. Dear guests, dear visitors, it is my pleasure to welcome today a distinguished guest, Professor John Cook, who will talk to us about misinformation and conspiracy theory research. Dr. Cook is a research assistant professor at the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. So John actually studied physics at the University of Queensland, and he did his postgraduate honors studying solar physics. And his climate change and interest in climate change research and climate change science was sparked when he received a copy of a speech by Oklahoma Republican Senator James Inhofe, most known to climate change professionals as having attached greatest hoax known to man, tag to anthropogenic climate change. So John created Skeptical Science website in 2007. So the goal of that website was to explain what peer-reviewed science can say about global warming. And since then, this website has been translated into 24 languages and has monthly readership about 400,000 visitors. So in 2013, John led several research projects, and one of his papers got an award for analyzing scientific consensus on climate change that has been highlighted by President Barack Obama and UK Prime Minister David Cameron. So John is author of multiple journal articles in science, environmental research letters, Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition, and many, many others. He's also the author of and co-author of several books, including Climate Change Denial Heads in the Sand, Climate Change Science, Modern Synthesis, and many, many others. So we are very happy to have John today speaking to us about his recent research, and I will start by asking him a very simple question. John, you started as a natural scientist and as a person studying physics. So why is it important for scientists of natural science to know about climate change communication and science communication in general? What can they learn from it?
Well, probably one way to answer that is to explain how I learned about the science of science communication and why it was important. So thanks for that intro, by the way. It was a long bio. But part of it was when I started the Skeptical Science website, and I was for the first time doing science communication and public engagement about climate change. And I was doing that from the background of someone having studied natural science. I didn't even know that there was a science to science communication. I didn't know that there was research into how to most effectively communicate science. And so at one point, a cognitive scientist, Lewandowski, several years into doing skeptical science, he emailed me and said, here's some research into debunking myths, which is what you're doing. But the research finds that if you don't do it the best way, if you don't do it in a way that's consistent with the research, then you can actually either be unproductive or potentially counterproductive. You can reinforce myths if you debunk the myths in the wrong way. And this was a revelation to me because it turns out I was debunking myths in that wrong way. I was putting the emphasis on facts. I was putting the emphasis on the myths that I was trying to debunk rather than the facts that I was trying to replace the myths with. And so that was, I guess, a life-changing email in a way, because learning that there was a science to science communication I also learned that if you don't follow the research, you can be engaging the public in ways that are unproductive or counterproductive. And that inspired me to start researching researching the psychology of debunking, digging into the existing research, and then eventually doing research myself.
Thank you. So what is the overlap? I know that your recent research is primarily on debunking misinformation and some conspiracies about science, conspiracy theories about science. So what's the overlap between what you're doing and character assassination as a new field of study?
Yeah, when I moved to George Mason University in 2017, I didn't even know, again, as someone who'd just done a PhD in science communication, I wasn't even aware of the field of character assassination, to be honest. And it was when I met you and your CARP lab that I thought, wow, that's I can see why we need a discipline studying this exact topic. But at the same time that I met you and I learned about CARP and I learned about this growing body of research into character assassination, I was also working with political scientists in the UK on training a machine to detect and categorize climate misinformation. So we spent several years, it turns out, basically training a machine to take climate misinformation and categorize it into different types of climate denial arguments. And once we trained the machine, we basically turned it on. It was kind of like that moment in The Imitation Game, that movie about Turing, where he built this big artificial intelligence machine, and they flick it on, and all the cogs start whirring. And it wasn't really like that, but to me, in my head, it was. And so we fed 20 years of climate misinformation into our machine, and got it to build a history of climate denial. And what we found blew us away, because the biggest result by far was that misinformation attacking scientists was not only the biggest category of misinformation, it was more than all the other categories combined. So there's a lot of climate denial arguments about the greenhouse effect or the carbon cycle or climate impacts or just scientific-based arguments. But much greater than that were arguments attacking scientists and attacking climate science, trying to erode public trust in science and scientists. And we realized, and I especially realized, as someone who had been debunking science arguments for the last decade, in a sense, I've been fighting in the wrong battlefield. The real battle is over here in character assassination. That's where all the misinformation is targeted. And one last thing, that might sound like really interesting research, but it's still going through review. So I can't provide a link for people to read the paper yet.
Well, thank you, John. So let's talk about today's world. And we know that today's pandemic has been accompanied with a lot of nonsense, a lot of disinformation, half-truths, conspiracy theories going on. And those conspiracy theories spread virally online through social networks. I could see how that damages society in many ways. For example, the myth that COVID-19 is less dangerous than the seasonal flu was deployed by Donald Trump as a justification for delaying mitigation policies. So your new research on debunking those conspiracy theories and trying to understand them is actually a really interesting research, because it's actually in the long term will help our society in many good ways. Can you just talk about what is a conspiracy theory? Because we know about there are two types of conspiracies, right? There is a real conspiracies that exist, like for example, Volkswagen conspired to cheat emission tests for their diesel engine, right? Or tobacco industry deceived the public about harmful health effects of smoking. But there are some conspiracy theories that are very toxic and poisonous and they harm society in many ways. Can you just talk about this concept?
Yeah, so when we published the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, Stefan Lewandowski and myself, and we published it, I think it was in March, so it was only like 2 months ago. The first issue we addressed was the fact that real conspiracies do exist. But when a real conspiracy is uncovered, that looks a lot different to the way conspiracy theories, like baseless conspiracy theories, get propagated on the internet. Real conspiracy theories, there are specific traits to the type of people who uncover them. Usually they're uncovered by whistleblowers, but the people who investigate them, they firstly, they display a healthy skepticism, and they are also responsive to evidence. And those traits are, and thirdly, they value coherence. They try to avoid holding positions that are mutually contradictory. And those three traits are in stark contrast to conspiracy theorists and the traits of conspiratorial thinking. Because in that case, we see a nihilistic skepticism, basically just a disbelief in any evidence that contradicts their theory or their beliefs. We see there's elements of contradictory, I guess, incoherence. Conspiracy theorists, they have an overwhelming, unshaken belief that the official account is wrong. And because of that that's their starting point, they're willing to hold contradictory beliefs, as long as both those beliefs contradict the main account. And I'll give you an example to make that a bit more tangible. In the pandemic video, which was a conspiracy theory video that went viral a few weeks ago, their main belief is that we can't trust the mainstream scientific position that the COVID-19 virus began naturally from Wuhan and then propagated to humans. And so they provide the explanation that instead it came from a Wuhan lab and also in collaboration with US labs, so it was man-made. But then they also suggest that we got the virus from vaccinations that we've gotten in the past. Like COVID is in the vaccination. So anyone who's got a vaccination already has the virus inside them. And every time they put on a mask, they activate the virus, which is a non-existent process. But first time I heard of it was in the pandemic video. But they're proposing these two contradictory positions in the one video. It came from a Wuhan lab, or we already got it from vaccinations. Both can't be true at the same time, but because of their unshakable belief that you can't trust the mainstream account, you can't trust Anthony Fauci, they entertain these contradictory ideas. Your volume's just gone off, Serge.
So you talk about this conventional versus conspiratorial thinking in your handbook. Why do you think conspiracy theories are so popular?
Well, conspiracy theories' popularity wane and increase over time depending on the circumstances. And the circumstances where they're most popular is when people feel threatened, when there is discord and trouble, and when people basically feel out of control, when random events are sweeping over them. Because people hate that feeling of randomness. We're just uncomfortable with randomness. We like order and patterns, and the notion that someone is in control. And so even though it seems kind of counterintuitive that some evil conspirators are running the show, that is psychologically more comforting than the idea that random events are causing these things like pandemics.
Thank you. So maybe you can just talk briefly about, how they actually damage, because we talk about the effects of conspiracy theories, but has there been any research to measure the effects of conspiracy theories that have been maybe operationalized and quantified?
So there's a lot of research into the impact that conspiratorial thinking has on people and their attitudes, and also research into what happens when people are exposed to conspiracy theories. And both lines of research, whether it's experimental or correlational, find the same result, which is that conspiratorial thinking and conspiracy theories is associated with higher distrust in scientific institutions and institutions in general. So when people, so for example, research found that when people were told conspiracy theories, even if they didn't believe the conspiracy theory, it still reduced their trust in institutions. And so it's this corrosive influence that we don't even realize necessarily is happening to us. It can happen almost at a subconscious level. And the reason why that's damaging is because, well, I mean, public trust in institutions is important for democracy, I think, generally, even outside of a pandemic. But when you have it happen in this current situation, if people aren't trusting what the experts, especially the medical experts, are advising us, if they're telling us to social distance, if they're telling us, here are the actions you need to do to keep yourself and your community safe. If people don't trust those voices and they're not following that advice, that's putting everyone into immediate danger.
So in your handbook, you talk about 7 types of conspiratorial thinking and 7 traits of how people process those conspiracies and how they react to them. Can you just go over some of these types and explain the most popular of them?
Yeah, okay. So with the conspiracy theory handbook, our purpose was to make the research into conspiracy theories more accessible, just summarize it, make it concise, make it simple to understand, and make this research accessible to the general public. And what you see in the research is 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking emerge from all the various studies. And so we wrote the document in December, January, and then on a flight back from Australia in January, I think it was actually on New Year's Eve, I took the 7 traits and thought, all right, I need to summarize these traits with an acronym so that people will be able to remember them. So I spent several hours trying to shoehorn them into an easy to remember acronym. I started with tinfoil, which is 7 letters, so it was perfect, but I just couldn't crack the L. So then I went to conspire without the E on the end and got that to work. So the traits of conspiratorial thinking are they're contradictory, they involve overriding suspicion, there's nefarious intent. They always think that the conspirators have evil intent. There's an unshakable belief that something must be wrong. There's persecuted victimhood. The conspiracy theorists believe simultaneously that they are the victim of this conspiracy, but also that they're the hero that's fighting against the evil conspirators. Where are we up to? Conspire. So I stands for immune to evidence. Any information or evidence or facts that you present that falsify the conspiracy theory, they interpret as confirming the conspiracy theory. They, for example, in climate change, there was a conspiracy theory that scientists were all faking the data for climate change. And there were 9 separate investigations into scientists to find out whether they actually were faking the data. Every investigation concluded that there was no evidence of wrongdoing. And the way that conspiracy theorists interpreted each investigation was, well, those investigators are part of the conspiracy as well. So they expanded their conspiracy theory to include the evidence that disproved the conspiracy theory. And the last trait of conspiratorial thinking is reinterpreting randomness, which is taking random events and joining the dots between them. There's a biolab in Wuhan. Well, the virus started in Wuhan. That lab must have originated the virus. Or the COVID came out in 2019. 5G came out in 2019. Well, isn't that convenient? 5G must have caused COVID. So these are the kind of joining the dots that conspiracy theorists always do.
Thank you, John. So let's talk about now responses, because we talked about the causes, we talked about the effects. Let's talk about responses. And I'm actually looking at your chapter in this handbook on deception, fake news, and misinformation online, where you had a chapter published. So, and
that's a great free plug there for your book.
Right. So based on your chapter about understanding and countering misinformation about climate change, do the same rules apply to responses to conspiracy theories?
Yeah. So conspiracy theorists or conspiracy theories are really one aspect of science denial. Being a person who loves making acronyms, we developed an acronym for the 5 traits of science denial: fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. So conspiracy theories are an integral part of science denial. And the traits of science denial are the same as the traits of conspiratorial thinking: distrust of scientists, distrust of scientific data, immunity to contrary evidence. And so all the techniques that I've been developing for countering science denial and countering misinformation, when we reviewed the literature into countering conspiracy theories, a lot of those techniques are applied in that context as well. Do you want me to go into like get a little bit more specific?
No, I mean, so I mean, could you give an example? For example, so how can you apply some of those responses in the real context? Because I know your research deals with a lot with inoculation theory, right? And applying inoculation to real case scenarios. Can you give any example how inoculation could, help us to deal with conspiracy theories?
So one thing we really stress in the conspiracy theory handbook is the importance of audience. Different audiences require different framing or different messages or different approaches. And so really for simplicity, we kind of divide it into 2 audiences: conspiracy theorists and the people who aren't already fully buying into a conspiracy theory. And we make the argument that, there are different strategies, and we do provide strategies for trying to convince a conspiracy theorist. But we also stress that that is a really difficult task to change the mind of a conspiracy theorist because of their immunity to evidence. And so a potentially more fruitful approach, particularly if you have limited communication resources, is targeting the vast majority of the public who aren't yet conspiracy theorists, or at least aren't fully buying into it, and inoculating them against the misinformation. And so you mentioned inoculation theory. The idea really of inoculation theory is it's not about trying to cure, to use an unfortunate medical term, the people who are already infected. It's about stopping the misinformation from spreading. And the way you inoculate people is by, just as with vaccination, you inoculate by exposing people to a weakened form of the misinformation. And so that really is the main technique that we recommend. You can inoculate people against conspiracy theories or against science misinformation by explaining to them the different techniques or traits used to mislead. So helping people be aware of those 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking, or be aware of the 5 techniques of science denial. When people are more aware of those techniques and aware of how they can be misled, that gives them resilience and immunity so that they're less likely to be misled.
John, I know that you wear different hats, that you worked at some point as a web developer, and you're known as a very talented cartoonist. So I would like to talk about your recent book of cartoons, because not a lot of people think about cartoons and caricatures as effective ways to counter misinformation. And also you work with web developers and trying to apply different formats like gamification to countering misinformation. So we all heard about your website, Cranky Uncle, where that goes
Have you
along
all?
with
Well,
the
that's
game,
good.
right?
I've been
So
trying to get the word out.
maybe you can just talk about those aspects of countering misinformation and conspiracy theories in general.
Yeah, so like my research is mainly focused on how do you inoculate the public against misinformation. And I've been exploring critical thinking as a way of doing that, and explaining logical flaws in misinformation, fallacies and denial techniques. And so in working on that, working with critical thinking philosophers, thank you. Oh man, you are really on the board. I don't even have a copy of my book handy.
It's okay, I will prepare it. So that's John's most recent book on countering misinformation. And basically it's a book of cartoons. And all of these cartoons John drew himself. So it has all the several categories of cartoons based by most recent research. And at the end, he's got fact, myth, fallacy summary, educating people how to properly respond to some of the most popular types of misinformation.
I posted a copy of it to my dad several weeks ago. And then yesterday he texted me and said, I got the book finally. So I got on a call with him and I said, so Dad, what did you think of the book? And he said, it's very colorful. I might put that as a blurb on the second edition. It's very colorful, John's dad. So anyway, sorry, I got a bit derailed, but what I found in my critical thinking work is that one powerful way of explaining logical flaws in misinformation is parallel arguments. Take that bad logic and transplant it into an extreme, absurd situation to make the logical flaw clear, more obvious. And it's basically using analogies to explain logic. And I realized that cartoons were the perfect delivery mechanism for parallel argumentation and explaining bad logic and misinformation and inoculating people. And so this book is basically me taking all the cognitive science, the critical thinking, and all the climate science work that I've done over the last decade and boiling it down into these very colorful parallel argument debunkings of climate myths.
So, John, what about the game? So you mentioned the game that you are developing at the same time with the book. Can you talk about this smartphone game that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so everything that I've talked about up to now in the context of inoculation is what researchers call passive inoculation. You're delivering inoculating messages to a passive audience who are in a one-way direction receiving all that information. But there's, just over the last few years, researchers have started to investigate active inoculation as another way of inoculating the public against misinformation. And active inoculation basically takes the form of interactive games where players interacting with a game, learning the techniques of misinformation through these interactive exercises in order to get inoculated against the misinformation. And there's a website, getbadnews.com, created by John Rosenbeek and Sander van der Linden, which inoculates people against the techniques of fake news. And inspired by that effort, we started working on a active inoculation game for smartphones that takes all the critical thinking work in the Cranky Uncle book, all those cartoons and the logic-based inoculations, and converts it into game form. So we've been working on that for the last half year, and we're actually due to release the game on June 30. So in fact, I'm going straight after this webinar, I'll be meeting with the developers to have a look at how the game's shaping up at the moment.
Would the game be available for Android as well?
Are you an Android user, Serge? Well, I mean...
So is it only for Apple users or for Android as well?
Well, I'm an iPhone user and I'm actually a bit of an Apple fanboy. but I know that I'd get crucified if we only released it for Apple. The way we're developing it is it's going to come out for Android and Apple, but the platform should also be able to release the game in browser form as well. And that's really important to us because my sense is that the game will have its biggest impact used in classrooms. And from when I talk to high school teachers, a lot of them are asking me, can they use the game in a browser, which is often the only way that they can do it in classrooms.
So there was a question also before this webinar about your use of machine learning, and you mentioned something in the beginning. Could you elaborate more on how machine learning can help us to fight misinformation and character assassination?
So, well, the way we've applied machine learning is training a machine to detect misinformation automatically, and not only detect it, but categorize it. And there are a number of ways you can do that. It can be either completely automatic or semi-automatic. We took a semi-automatic approach where we manually train the machine, which is a really laborious process. We read tens of thousands of paragraphs, content analyzing them. And as you and I know, having read tens of thousands of, or at least thousands of paragraphs of misinformation ourselves, that's a really difficult task. But there are lots of different ways because fake news has lots of telltale patterns, whether it's in the content itself or where it comes from, or even temporal patterns on how misinformation arrives and then decays. And so there are a whole range of machine learning techniques that can be used to detect misinformation. And what that allows us to do is be able to detect misinformation in real time, which allows us to potentially respond much quicker, which is important because misinformation can arise and then just disseminate through the population really fast. We need to be able to detect it as quickly as possible and be able to respond fast.
Thank you, John. So I think it's time to segue to Q&A. Colleagues, and I encourage you to post your questions here in this group chat. So we have a first question from Jeremy. Have there been any COVID-19 focused conspiracy theories that have targeted companies or corporate sector? If so, what has been the angle of the attack?
I mean, I'm just speaking kind of vaguely. I think that the one thing that I'm learning is that there's a huge overlap between COVID deniers or downplayers and anti-vaxxers. I actually came into this over the last month thinking, hey, the COVID could kind of be the final nail in the coffin of the anti-vaccination movement, because surely, my hypothesis was that that one of the reasons why anti-vaxxers are viable is because people have just forgotten how terrible smallpox and polio and these preventable diseases were in the past. We have very short memories. Have a pandemic that just cripples the whole world, and surely people would see the importance of vaccination. I was so wrong on that. Like, the anti-vaxxer movement has become invigorated by and using COVID as a rallying point, because they're saying that there's this idea of mandatory vaccination coming down the pipeline. They're using that concept to sell fear and build their movement. And the anti-vaxxer movement, an element of it is anti-corporation or anti-pharmaceutical companies, conspiracy theories that pharmaceutical companies create diseases in order to develop the vaccines, in order to make a profit selling us the vaccine. So they create the problem and the solution and then make their profits from selling us the solution. So we are seeing those kind of arguments come forward. One being Bill Gates. There's a lot of conspiracy theories around him because he gave a talk in, I think, 2014, predicting that a pandemic was coming down the pipeline. He's not Nostradamus. Health experts all over the world, all the time, were saying that this was coming. It was a matter of time. But there's also a lot of conspiracy theories about Bill Gates because he's very active in the health space at the moment. So anti-vaxxers already had him in their sights. And so I think that that's the general tenor of any conspiracy theories that are corporate related.
So we have a question from a young and but very brilliant scientist from University of Amsterdam, Martin X. His question is, what things are climate scientists typically attacked for on a personal level? So what are the most popular types of attacks on climate change scientists?
Well, I've been working with a young PhD student at George Mason University, yourself, looking at this. And again, this is not yet published research, but what we found, and I feel weird explaining your own research to you. It's like student-splaining or something. But what we found was the most common form of character attack on climate scientists were bias attacks, as in accusing scientists of being biased, being either politically motivated or pushing an agenda in some sort of agenda. And the second most common form of ad hominem that we found were moral attacks, as in saying scientists were either being deceptive or motivated by greed or unethical in some way.
Thank you. So I have a question from Karen Nauman. Please tell us where to source the Tinman acronym meaning.
Tinman. The Conspire acronym?
Right.
So if you go to the following URL, sks.to/conspiracy, that'll take you to the Conspiracy Theory Handbook, where we provide the acronym Conspire, listing the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking.
Thank you. So, question from Eric Shuraev. Do you think there are some psychological states like dysphoria or personality traits like pessimism that make some people more susceptible to conspiracy theories than others?
I'm pretty sure that there is, but off the top of my head, I just can't immediately think of the relevant research. So I probably shouldn't speculate and lead people astray. Sorry. But we do, we touch on this in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook and provide all the relevant research. So there is a section there where we do talk about what conditions and traits predispose people towards conspiracy theories. So I'd probably direct you there.
So, John, I know you've been the target of character assassination campaigns and character attacks for a long time, and you are a very favorite subject of some contrarians who labeled you as a blogger and not a real scientist, and young researcher, and many other names. So can you, based on your experience, tell us how to talk to conspiracy theorists and how to talk to someone who is trying to smear you and, basically question your character and your competence?
The approach and the mindset I take whenever I'm engaging with conspiracy theorists or science deniers who are, challenging me or attacking me is I try to turn those exchanges into potential teachable moments, not necessarily for that person, but for everyone else who's watching the exchange. So often when I'm giving public talks, there'll be someone in the audience who will, during the Q&A, will challenge me with climate misinformation or even attack me. And so in my response to them, while I'm talking to them, I'm recognizing, like, the literature tells us that I actually have very little chance of changing their mind. And so instead, what I do is I try to respectfully explain whatever fallacy or technique is in the misinformation that they're presenting, and also the facts. So I try to explain the facts, explain the fallacy that the myth uses to distort the facts. And my audience for that kind of explanation is really for everyone who's watching that exchange. And taking that mindset is actually, I find, really helpful, because it means I'm a lot calmer. It can be quite threatening if someone's coming at you and saying, you're in the pay of George Soros, or you're just a blogger from Brisbane. Why should we trust anything you say? And so I think that taking that kind of mindset that you're probably not going to change that person's mind, that removes that frustration and allows you to speak in a much more calm, dispassionate way. And how you speak is just as important as what you say.
So Rod is asking, so what's the difference between a conspiracy theory and out lie? So my understanding of conspiracy theory is just an alternative narrative to like official narrative, because some conspiracies and conspiracy theories might not be necessarily wrong. Like for example, the weapons of mass destruction was a conspiracy theory, and then it turned out to be correct. But we already talked about that some of them are really, really based on deception, right, and lie. So Rod's question is, well, what's the difference between the actual conspiracy theory and the lie?
Well, I mean, a lie or a falsehood or misinformation can be about anything, but conspiracy theories are a subset of that, which are particularly about a small group or a large group or a group of evil conspirators who are all secretly plotting to deceive us and victimize us in some way. So there's that element of the persecuted victimhood, of the nefarious intent, and the not believing in the official account. So not believing in the official account, I guess, is a lie, is the falsehood. But then there's those other elements of the secret conspirators, and once you start going down the rabbit hole, believing that there are these secret, all-powerful conspirators deceiving us all, then all those other traits of conspiratorial thinking become inevitable. They start reinterpreting randomness. They become immune to evidence. Everything kind of falls into place once you start disbelieving the official account.
Yeah, I just saw of Rod's previous comment. Isn't there a contradiction in the pandemic? Result that you have the shutdown protesters aligning with the anti-vaxxers, so that the conspiracy is a sort of negotiated conspiracy?
You cut out a little bit, but I didn't quite understand the question. Maybe if I jump up and find...
Well, maybe Rod, maybe you can rephrase the question so I can ask it again. So Jeremy's asking again, so what are the most effective channels of communication for inoculation messaging in addition to games and cartoons?
Yeah, this is a question that has really occupied my thinking for the last few years, because I've been researching how do you inoculate, and I've been testing all these different ways, but how do you deploy that? How do you deploy it at scale? Like really following the inoculation analogy, we need to get herd immunity in order to eradicate science denial. And how do you get it out there when you have communities existing in these echo chambers and in these kind of siloed communities, and social media is fragmenting the public and only delivering content that people already agree with? So how do you negotiate all that? And there are probably a whole range of answers to that, and a lot of different techniques. But what I've been narrowing my focus on is the idea of deploying inoculation through classrooms. I think that improving critical thinking, getting critical thinking material more widespread in both high school, ideally even in middle school, but high school and college classes is the key to, I think, more widespread inoculating the public. And I really started to realize that as I began developing the Cranky Uncle game, I would talk to climate scientists about this game, because the game, you're really on your game there. So the game was originally for climate misinformation. I've since now broadened it to science misinformation in general. But whenever I talked to climate scientists who were educators, I was taken aback by their enthusiasm to incorporate the game in their own classrooms. And before we'd even developed the game, but we had a rough, simple prototype, the teachers were already testing the prototype in their classes. And this was all across the country, in red states, in blue states, And that made me realize that I think classrooms are a key to penetrating these echo chambers and really deploying critical thinking content to like the whole country, not just preaching to the choir.
Yeah, we talked about before about the advantages of media literacy and literacy in general, science literacy, and their importance for public schools and universities and for lay audience in general. Do you think that maybe we're not doing enough to teach general public about science and about literacy, media literacy in general?
Absolutely, we're not doing enough. And I think, I mean, we've started collecting pilot data from these tests of the game in classrooms, and take this with a grain of salt because it's just preliminary pilot data, but we've tested it in high school classes as well as college classes. And the test we did was test their critical thinking, the ability to detect fallacies in misinformation. And we tested it before and after the game. Well, firstly, we found that the game did improve their ability to detect fallacies and misinformation. But what was also striking was the high school results were identical to undergraduate college results. And so what I'm interpreting from that preliminary data with a grain of salt is that I don't think that critical thinking is taught much in high schools or even in undergraduate college classes, which is why we see little difference between the two in the tests that we've made, at least.
So this question from Caroline Winter. So you mentioned those gated communities and so those echo chambers online. So her question is about those online communities that build their identities around conspiracy theories. So is it harder to convince members of those communities that they are wrong, since their view is basically based on that identity?
I think it is harder for several reasons. One is, I think that when they form these communities, it's harder to get in there. And secondly, it's harder because when you are surrounding yourself with people who share your views, you have this distorted social consensus. Like you think, oh, everyone around me believes this, and that makes it easier for you to believe it, and you hold on to those beliefs more strongly. And so, so social media has made it a lot easier to create these like-minded communities, which we had in the past. We've always had, but it's turbocharged now, and it makes it it makes it more of a challenge from a communication point of view. But again, I think that that's why inoculating the rest of the public is probably our best effort. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to reach those communities, but it's harder than ever.
Another question is from Ekaterina. Do you see any new trends in how people decide what scientific information they trust during the COVID-19 pandemic? For example, do you see any new or uninspected sources of information that people are turning to during this time?
That's a good question. I don't have anything informed to say to that question. I don't know. One thing is, even though the people, the COVID deniers or downplayers, the protesters, they get all the media coverage. Overall, there is much higher acceptance of the science, the mainstream scientific position on COVID-19 than compared to, say, climate change. Because the topic is so salient and so immediate, the public at large are on board with science. There's overwhelming support for social distancing measures and support for what scientists are saying about COVID-19. So just as with climate change, there's this sort of, I guess, tendency to think that the minority dissenters are much larger than they really are, because they are such a vocal minority. We shouldn't forget that they are a very small proportion, and COVID deniers are even smaller than climate deniers. And so I think overall the general public are on board with what the scientists are saying and support social distancing measures. And it's just unfortunate that because the minority is so vocal that they have a disproportionate influence on policy and even public opinion.
So Montana is wondering, in line with Caroline's question, considering scarcity principles and the nature of conspiracy theories to hold their beliefs as personal, unique, or valued items, has there been any research into approaching conspiracy theorists from a sympathetic, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm just want to understand you angle?
Yes, there has. And we do provide links to some of that research in the Conspiracy Theory Handbook. So I'm kind of downplaying it, but we do have a page in the handbook on how to talk to conspiracy theorists. And we provide 4 different strategies or approaches that you can take in talking to them. One of them is empathy. So it is empathizing with their position and trying to understand them. Another is shared values. Conspiracy theorists like to think of themselves as critical thinkers because they are, they don't think of themselves as gullible. They don't think that they're being tricked by the mainstream account. And so a combination of empathy and appealing to critical thinking, but trying to encourage them to turn that critical thinking onto the theory is a potentially fruitful response.
So I'm trying to ask the same question from Rod, as far as I understand. So question, the pandemic suggests that the COVID-19 virus is a man-made, but also that the virus is in the vaccines. So when you look at the protests in Massachusetts and other states, you have a number of folks angry at China for being quarantined, combined with a number of anti-vaxxers. Just wondering if the contradiction in the pandemic conspiracy came about to accommodate both groups.
I mean, certainly there is this alliance between the anti-vaxxer movement and the COVID conspiracy theorists, and I think a lot of anti-vaxxers have just kind of gloved onto the issue of COVID as a way to promote their agenda. I wouldn't say that it's 2 different conspiracy theories from 2 different groups kind of trying to mesh together. I think that contradictory thinking is just an inherent part of conspiracy theories. And there are actually a number of different contradictions in pandemic. I talked about it comes from vaccinations versus it came from Wuhan, but also there's just contradictions in the way that they treat evidence. The main one of the points made in the video is that you can't trust medical research because they all get funding if they promote the party line, and you don't get funded if you promote a alternative conclusion. So you can't trust scientific research. But then she'll just go and cite any scientific research that backs up her opinion anyway. So what is it? Can you trust science or can't you? It's a very selective approach to scientific data. The other thing is, there's another contradiction in there that has just gone out of my head, so I'll end it there.
Okay, so I know that you have your own taxonomy that is still under development, but you already have several publications about it, based on different types and categories of misinformation, right? So what's the future of that taxonomy? So, and is there any link to character assassination?
Okay, so the taxonomy that I've developed is based on the 5 techniques of science denial, the FLIC, fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and conspiracy theories. But underneath those 5 categories, there are a whole range of fallacies and techniques. I recently added the 7 traits of conspiratorial thinking under conspiracy theories. Under logical fallacies, we have the ad hominem attack. So that's attacking the scientists rather than making scientific arguments. And underneath ad hominem, currently it stands as it is, but research that you and I have been doing has been teasing apart the different types of ad hominems. So down the track, I'll be breaking that up into the types of attacks, whether they're attacking scientists for being biased or being immoral or being incompetent or using circumstantial type ad hominems or using guilt by association. There are these different techniques of ad hominem attacks, and teaching people to understand these techniques will help them to detect an ad hominem attack when they see it, and therefore be less vulnerable to being misled by it.
We only have 5 minutes left, so we still have time for one more question. But maybe if you can just talk briefly about your future research, or maybe something that you're working on right now that we all should look forward to and expect to read sometime soon.
What I've been doing over the last month is reflecting on the fact that public tolerance for misinformation is lower now than it has been in as long as I can remember, about misinformation about COVID-19. The public recognize that misinformation about COVID-19 is dangerous. Like, it's literally dangerous to our health. And so given that public salience and concern and prioritization of misinformation, I've been spending the last few months really deep diving into misinformation about COVID and grouping it by the different fallacies that you find in the misinformation. So what I'm working on now is, in fact, I was just working on it this morning, is I want to create a set of videos that look at different techniques of science denial, but using examples from COVID-19 as a way of illustrating these different science denial fallacies. And so the goal of it is twofold. One is to improve people's critical thinking skills and build their resilience against misinformation in general. But secondly, also counter the misinformation about COVID-19, which is right now endangering the public.
There is a last question I have from Caroline. Are there any particular entertaining or fun conspiracy theories you came across, maybe like lizard people?
My what I think is the most entertaining conspiracy theory I've encountered over the last month, ever really, is the theory that the UK government intentionally started COVID-19 through 5G cell towers. But not only that, but knowing that they were going to do it now, back before the pandemic began, they put secret symbols on the £20 UK note, hinting that there's a little symbol, a round thing with bumps on it that you could interpret as a coronavirus image, and there is this tower-looking thing, which is actually a building I think in London. But they said, oh, a tower. Oh, something that looks like COVID. That's a 5G tower in COVID. The British government created COVID through 5G. So they've taken these images and, reinterpreting randomness, they've interpreted it as a secret hint that for some reason the British government, planning and plotting to disable the entire world, including themselves, who are one of the hardest hit countries, they decided to give us a little heads up that they were going to do it through these secret images on their currency.
So before the webinar, some people asked me about your background, and they were curious. You came from Australia to the US, and you've been doing a lot of research in this country now. Is there any difference about doing misinformation research in Australia versus doing this in the US, and what's the difference between the two countries?
During my PhD, I actually ran experiments, the identical experiments using representative Australian samples versus representative US samples. In one of my papers, directly compared them, like the graphs were Australia, US side by side. And basically, like, one graph could really sum up the difference between Australia and the US. We're similar, but the US is the volume turned up to full. So when I plot political ideology and climate attitudes. In Australia, you have this incline. So you have the more politically liberal people are, the more their acceptance of climate change. And so the more conservative people are, the lower their acceptance of climate change. The US data, that slope is just much steeper. So climate change is more polarized and just there's a bigger difference between conservatives and liberals on issues like climate change. It's a similar dynamic, but just more intense over here.
Well, thank you, John. That's all questions we have for you. Would you like to conclude with any statements or any words of wisdom?
Words of wisdom. Well, you put me on the spot now. I got nothing.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. So we continue a series of webinars dedicated to our new handbook on character assassination research and reputation management. So please tune to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook group. And also don't forget to check out our blog, where we publish most recent information about character assassination, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and of course, science. And thank you, John Cook, our wonderful speaker today, who agreed to come and share his wisdom with us. So we will see you in 2 weeks, and our webinar will be on character assassination and caricatures. So the webinar will be moderated by Jennifer Cohen. So we'll see you in 2 weeks, and thanks again for joining us today. Thank you, John.